Welcome to History Teller YT, where history isn't just told, it comes alive. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most dramatic and transformative moments in Chinese history, the Boxer Rebellion of 1899 to 1901. This was not just a local uprising. It was a clash of cultures, a struggle against foreign powers, and a desperate fight for national survival. Imagine China at the turn of the century. Ancient traditions facing the unstoppable force of modern imperialism, spiritual warriors claiming divine protection, and an empire on the brink of collapse. For 2 years, peasants, monks, and local militias rose against foreign occupation and Christian missionaries, challenging the Qing dynasty itself. Yet their courage was met with overwhelming military force, leading to devastation, humiliation, and the reshaping of an entire nation. From secret rituals in the countryside to the international siege of Beijing, from the rise of anti-foreign sentiment to the seeds of Chinese nationalism, this story spans the spiritual, cultural, and political struggles that would define China's modern history. Stay with us as we unfold every shocking, inspiring, and unforgettable detail of the Boxer Rebellion. In the final years of the 19th century, China stood at the edge of collapse. Once the world's oldest and proudest civilization, the Qing Empire now found itself battered by foreign powers, humiliated by unequal treaties, and internally fractured by corruption and rebellion. For centuries, the Chinese had believed their empire to be the center of the world, the Middle Kingdom. But the Opium Wars and the arrival of European imperialism shattered that illusion. Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and Japan all carved their spheres of influence across the Chinese map, building railways, claiming ports, and demanding privileges that stripped China of its sovereignty. The common people watched helplessly as their emperor's authority faded and their traditions eroded under Western control. In the countryside, misery deepened. Floods from the Yellow River ruined harvests, locusts devoured crops, and poverty became unbearable. Christian missionaries, protected by foreign powers, spread their faith through rural villages, converting some Chinese peasants but angering many others. To countless villagers, Christianity felt like an invasion of the spirit, a direct challenge to their gods, ancestors, and way of life. Anger and superstition mixed together, creating a boiling cauldron of resentment. And from that cauldron, something ancient and violent began to rise. A movement that would soon call itself the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, known to foreigners as the Boxers. The Boxers were not soldiers. They were farmers, blacksmiths, laborers, and peasants, people who had lost everything to war, famine, and exploitation. What united them was not wealth or education, but rage and belief. The movement began in Shandong province, an area ravaged by drought and foreign control. Villagers there believed that secret martial arts rituals and spirit possession could make them immune to bullets. They practiced strange dances, shouted incantations, and trained their bodies with iron discipline, believing divine forces would protect them from Western weapons. Their leaders preached that the gods themselves had turned against the foreign devils who poisoned China with opium and Christian lies. The Boxers' message was simple but powerful. Support the Qing, destroy the foreign. Though they claimed loyalty to the Qing dynasty, their actions were unpredictable and violent. They attacked Christian converts, burned churches, and destroyed telegraph lines and railways, symbols of Western presence. To local officials, they were both a curse and a possible weapon. Many Qing bureaucrats feared their growing power, while others saw them as a useful tool to resist foreign domination. By 1898, the Boxer movement had spread like wildfire across northern China. Tens of thousands of followers gathered, carrying spears, swords, and banners covered in mystical symbols. They believed that their ancestors' spirits were fighting beside them. They claimed the gods had promised to drive out the foreigners and restore China's lost glory. It was no longer just a rebellion of the poor, it was a spiritual war for the soul of a nation. Inside the Forbidden City, Empress Dowager Cixi faced an impossible decision. The Qing dynasty, already weakened by decades of foreign humiliation, was struggling to survive. Western powers demanded more trade privileges and the right to station troops across Chinese soil. At the same time, millions of peasants were rising in fury, calling for blood. Some of Cixi's advisors warned her that the Boxers could destroy what remained of imperial authority, while others argued that they were the empire's last hope for salvation. Cixi was shrewd, calculating, and ruthless. She had ruled China from behind the throne for decades, manipulating emperors and generals alike. To her, the foreigners were parasites draining the life of China, but she also knew their armies were strong and their cannons unstoppable. Yet as the Boxers' momentum grew, reports flooded in of peasants performing miracles, swords bouncing off their skin, bullets failing to kill them. Whether she believed it or not, Cixi realized something crucial. The Boxers had ignited a fire in the hearts of the people that no imperial decree could match. In secret councils, the Empress began to weigh her options. Could she harness the Boxer fury to drive out the foreigners once and for all? Or would she doom the Qing Empire to annihilation? The year 1899 was approaching its end, and the storm was gathering over China. In the north, armies drilled in foreign-style uniforms, while in the villages, barefoot peasants sharpened their blades and prayed for divine power. The Middle Kingdom was about to explode, and the world would soon feel its shock. By early 1899, northern China had become a land of whispers and fear. Rumors spread faster than the telegraph lines that crisscrossed the plains. In dusty markets and temple courtyards, people murmured that divine warriors had returned, men who could call upon the spirits of the dead to protect China from the foreign devils. They said the gods had chosen the humble to destroy the mighty. The people called them Yehechuan, or the righteous and harmonious fists, though foreigners mockingly labeled them Boxers, because of their ritual combat exercises and martial stances. As the movement expanded, the violence turned deadly. In Shandong and Jili provinces, Boxers began ambushing Christian missionaries and their Chinese converts. Villagers accused Christians of angering the local gods and bringing misfortune to the land. Churches were burned, crosses smashed, and entire families slaughtered. Each attack drew more followers to the cause. The Boxers carried banners painted with bold red characters: "Support the Qing, destroy the foreigner." They saw themselves as soldiers of heaven, fighting not for greed or power, but for the soul of their nation. Meanwhile, foreign powers watched in alarm. British merchants in Tianjin wrote letters describing mobs marching through the streets chanting anti-foreign songs. French priests begged their consuls for protection. American diplomats sent frantic messages to Washington, warning that China was on the edge of a holy war. The Qing officials in Beijing tried to calm the situation, but their control over the countryside had already slipped away. The dragon throne trembled as the winds of rebellion howled stronger with every passing week. The Boxer movement was no longer a handful of angry peasants. It had become a wildfire stretching across provinces, consuming everything in its path. By the summer of 1899, thousands had joined their ranks. Farmers, bandits, soldiers who had deserted the army, and even scholars disillusioned by the government's weakness. They gathered in hidden temples and sacred groves, performing rituals that fused ancient Taoist magic with martial training. They believed their fists could channel spiritual energy, their chants could summon gods, and their devotion could make them invincible. Foreign witnesses dismissed them as superstitious fools, yet the Boxers' courage was terrifying. They faced gunfire armed only with spears, swords, and blind faith. In their eyes, death was not defeat but proof of loyalty to China and its ancestors. Reports began flooding Beijing. Telegraph lines were cut, railway bridges destroyed, missionaries murdered, and entire Christian villages wiped out. Panic spread among foreigners living in treaty ports. European powers demanded protection for their citizens and sent troops to guard embassies and railways. Inside China, confusion reigned. Some local officials secretly supported the Boxers, providing weapons and shelter. Others tried to suppress them only to be overrun or killed. To the peasants, the Boxers were heroes, defenders of China's purity. But to diplomats and merchants, they were fanatics on a crusade of blood. The Qing dynasty, weakened and divided, found itself walking a razor's edge. Every decision risked disaster. Cixi's court hesitated, unsure whether to crush the rebellion or embrace it as a weapon against the West. The fire kept spreading, and soon, it would reach the heart of the empire itself. By the winter of 1899, the line between rebellion and revolution had vanished. Northern China was in chaos. Villages declared themselves free of foreign rule, proclaiming loyalty to both the Boxers and the Qing throne. The imperial government sent envoys to investigate, but many of these officials returned with astonishing reports that the Boxers were gaining supernatural strength. Witnesses swore that swords could not cut them, that bullets turned to dust upon their skin. Whether true or not, these tales gave ordinary peasants the courage to challenge empires armed with modern rifles and cannons. Empress Dowager Cixi, hidden behind the thick red walls of the Forbidden City, faced a moment of destiny. The Qing court was split. Conservative officials urged her to harness the Boxers, to turn this fury against the foreigners who had humiliated China for decades. Reformists, however, warned her that aligning with superstition and mob violence would destroy the dynasty completely. But Cixi, ever calculating, saw opportunity. Foreign powers were growing arrogant, seizing railroads, mines, and ports as though China were their colony. If the Boxers succeeded, she could claim victory for the empire. If they failed, she could blame them and plead innocence. So she waited, allowing the rebellion to grow unchecked. The imperial edicts avoided condemning the Boxers outright, a silent signal that the throne was watching with approval. In the north, entire armies of peasants raised their flags and swore oaths before the gods. They were ready to march toward Beijing itself, to purge the capital of every foreigner and Christian they could find. The stage was set for one of the most explosive confrontations in modern history, a war not only between East and West, but between faith and technology, tradition and modernity, empire and survival. The year 1900 was about to dawn, and with it, the world would witness the birth of the final great uprising of Imperial China. As the first months of 1900 arrived, northern China trembled under an atmosphere thick with fear and anticipation. The Boxer movement had become unstoppable. From village to village, their numbers multiplied. Young men left their homes to join the sacred cause, carrying red sashes and crude weapons, their faces painted with charms to ward off evil. To them, the year 1900 was not just another turn of the calendar. It was a divine moment foretold by heaven itself, a time when spirits would rise and the gods would cleanse China of corruption and foreign infestation. Across the plains of Zhili province, thousands gathered in temples, beating drums and chanting mantras that echoed through the cold air. They invoked the names of ancient deities, Guan Yu, the god of war, and the Thunder Emperor, guardian of justice. The Boxers believed that through prayer, fasting, and martial rituals, they could summon divine possession, becoming vessels of heavenly power. Foreign observers who saw these rituals described scenes of mass hysteria, but to the participants, it was sacred transformation. When they marched, they believed they were walking side by side with ghosts of China's heroes, fighting once more for their homeland. Foreign missionaries and diplomats, however, saw an approaching storm. In reports sent from Tianjin and Beijing, Western residents warned of growing mobs gathering outside city walls. Roads were no longer safe. Bridges were burned and telegraph poles chopped down. Traders spoke of trains being ambushed, their passengers slain. The Qing authorities still hesitated, unsure whether to crush the Boxers or allow their fury to vent itself upon the hated foreigners. But hesitation would soon prove fatal, for the Boxers were no longer content to remain in the countryside. Their eyes were now fixed upon the capital itself, the shining heart of Imperial China. In May 1900, the Boxer armies began their march toward Beijing. It was not a disciplined military force, but a tidal wave of fanatic devotion. Tens of thousands advanced across the northern plains, armed with spears, swords, and boundless conviction. They burned churches, demolished foreign-built railroads, and executed anyone suspected of aiding Westerners. Entire Christian communities vanished overnight. Villagers who had once feared the foreign presence now joined the march, believing that divine justice was finally at hand. In the imperial capital, the foreign legations, clusters of embassies representing Britain, America, France, Russia, Germany, and Japan, fortified their compounds. Streets that had once bustled with trade and laughter grew eerily silent. Foreign women and children were gathered inside the legations for safety, while soldiers stood guard behind barricades of sandbags and furniture. The tension was unbearable. At any moment, the gates of Beijing could erupt in flames. Meanwhile, the Empress Dowager Cixi's court observed the growing chaos with mixed feelings. Conservative officials celebrated the Boxers' victories, proclaiming that the spirits of China were finally awakening. Others, more cautious, feared that such unbridled violence would invite foreign invasion. But as Boxer columns drew closer to the city, their leaders proclaimed that the gods themselves had commanded them to cleanse Beijing of its foreign plague. They believed the Empress would bless them, that the dragon throne would finally rise against the Western powers. The moment of decision was drawing near, and once again, Cixi would have to choose between submission and rebellion. The roads leading to the capital filled with the smoke of burning villages. Each plume of smoke marked another victory, another death, another prayer whispered to heaven. To the Boxers, the gods were answering. To the foreigners, hell itself was awakening on Chinese soil. In June 1900, the streets of Beijing pulsed with uncertainty. Rumors flowed through the forbidden city like a dark river. The Boxers were at the gates. Thousands of armed peasants surrounded the capital, waving banners and chanting their sacred oaths. They claimed that the Empress had called them to defend China, that the time had come to cast out every last foreigner. Inside her palace, Empress Dowager Cixi sat in silence, listening to her advisors argue. Some begged her to suppress the Boxers immediately. Others whispered that this was heaven's gift, an army raised by the gods to restore China's pride. Cixi had spent decades mastering survival through manipulation and patience. She understood that the Qing dynasty was cornered by humiliation. Foreign troops occupied Chinese soil, foreign traders dominated Chinese markets, and foreign missionaries mocked Chinese traditions. To her, the Boxers represented not only rebellion but redemption. They embodied a purity that no Western army could understand. In a dramatic shift, Cixi made her choice. She would side with the Boxers. She sent secret messages declaring her support, ordering the imperial army to join them in purging the capital of foreign influence. That decision changed everything. Overnight, Beijing became a fortress of rage. Chinese soldiers and Boxer fighters joined forces, surrounding the foreign legations. Fires blazed across the city as mobs attacked churches and embassies. Missionaries were killed in the streets. Diplomats armed themselves and prepared for siege. The world's most powerful empires were about to face a peasant uprising blessed by an ancient throne. The war of heaven and empire had begun. What started as a rural rebellion had now transformed into a full-scale confrontation between East and West. A battle that would determine not only China's fate, but the very meaning of resistance in an age of empire. In June 1900, the streets of Beijing pulsed with uncertainty. Rumors flowed through the forbidden city like a dark river. The Boxers were at the gates. Thousands of armed peasants surrounded the capital, waving banners and chanting their sacred oaths. They claimed that the Empress had called them to defend China, that the time had come to cast out every last foreigner. Inside her palace, Empress Dowager Cixi sat in silence, listening to her advisors argue. Some begged her to suppress the Boxers immediately. Others whispered that this was heaven's gift, an army raised by the gods to restore China's pride. Cixi had spent decades mastering survival through manipulation and patience. She understood that the Qing dynasty was cornered by humiliation. Foreign troops occupied Chinese soil, foreign traders dominated Chinese markets, and foreign missionaries mocked Chinese traditions. To her, the Boxers represented not only rebellion but redemption. They embodied a purity that no Western army could understand. In a dramatic shift, Cixi made her choice. She would side with the Boxers. She sent secret messages declaring her support, ordering the imperial army to join them in purging the capital of foreign influence. That decision changed everything. Overnight, Beijing became a fortress of rage. Chinese soldiers and Boxer fighters joined forces, surrounding the foreign legations. Fires blazed across the city as mobs attacked churches and embassies. Missionaries were killed in the streets. Diplomats armed themselves and prepared for siege. The world's most powerful empires were about to face a peasant uprising blessed by an ancient throne. The war of heaven and empire had begun. What started as a rural rebellion had now transformed into a full-scale confrontation between East and West. A battle that would determine not only China's fate, but the very meaning of resistance in an age of empire. June 1900, the dawn of chaos in Beijing. The city, once the proud heart of the Middle Kingdom, now trembled beneath a sky filled with smoke. The Boxers had entered the capital. Carrying their red banners and chanting ancient invocations, they poured through the gates like a divine storm. Foreigners barricaded themselves inside the Legation Quarter, a cluster of embassies surrounded by high walls and narrow streets. It was there that diplomats, soldiers, missionaries, and families from 11 nations gathered for survival. At first, the foreign community believed the Qing government would protect them. After all, treaties had guaranteed their safety. But that illusion quickly collapsed. The Empress Dowager had thrown her support behind the Boxers, declaring war on foreign powers. Imperial troops joined the rebels, surrounding the Legation Quarter with artillery and rifles. On June 20th, 1900, the German minister, Baron von Ketteler, was shot and killed while trying to deliver a diplomatic message to the Qing court, a signal that diplomacy was over. The siege began that same day. Thousands of Boxers and Qing soldiers advanced on the legations, their war cries echoing through the streets. The defenders, a mix of Marines, missionaries, and civilians, scrambled to build barricades from bricks, sandbags, and furniture. They had few weapons, little ammunition, and almost no hope of reinforcement. Yet they were determined to hold their ground. The air filled with the sound of gunfire, drums, and burning wood as the Boxers launched their first assaults. Beijing had become a battlefield, and the world was watching. Inside the Legation Quarter, chaos turned to endurance. About 900 foreign soldiers and roughly 3,000 Chinese Christian converts huddled together, surrounded by an estimated 20,000 attackers. The defenders came from 13 nations: Britain, America, Japan, France, Germany, Italy, Austria-Hungary, and others. They spoke different languages, carried different flags, and followed different gods. Yet they now fought side by side for one thing only: survival. Day after day, the Boxers and Qing troops fired rifles and launched flaming arrows over the walls. Bullets riddled windows, flames devoured roofs. Foreign women worked as nurses, treating the wounded, while children carried ammunition between barricades. Food ran short and water had to be rationed. The summer heat turned the compound into a furnace, filled with the stench of blood and smoke. Every night, defenders braced for another attack, wondering if dawn would ever come. Outside the walls, the Boxers saw themselves as divine warriors fulfilling heaven's will. They believed the gods would shield them from bullets. They built siege engines and dug tunnels to plant explosives under the foreign defenses. Every death was seen as a sacrifice for China's redemption. But even as the Boxers' courage burned bright, their weapons could not match the firepower of the defenders' rifles and machine guns. The siege dragged on, both sides exhausted but unyielding. Letters smuggled out of the city described the horror. "We are surrounded, cut off from the world. Each day we bury our dead. Each night we pray for rescue." The world's great powers, shocked by the killing of diplomats and missionaries, prepared for retribution. An international army was gathering, and soon it would march toward Beijing. The siege of the legations stretched into weeks, and desperation took root. Ammunition dwindled, rations thinned, and disease spread among the trapped foreigners and their Chinese Christian allies. Yet even in the darkest hours, courage endured. Missionaries who had once preached peace now carried rifles. Diplomats became soldiers. Every man, woman, and child played a role in holding the barricades. At night, the defenders listened to the haunting chants of the Boxers echoing through the streets, prayers to spirits and ancestors asking for victory. The city seemed possessed by madness and faith intertwined. In the Forbidden City, Empress Dowager Cixi received reports that the foreigners were close to collapse. Her generals assured her that victory was near. The Boxers, she was told, were invincible. But the Empress also began to hear whispers that foreign armies were on the move, landing at Tianjin and marching inland. She dismissed them at first, believing China's divine cause could not fail. Yet deep in her heart, she knew that the world's wrath would soon descend upon her empire. By mid-July, the sound of cannons could be heard in the distance. The defenders inside the legations felt both hope and dread. They were still alive, but how much longer could they last? Every sunrise was a miracle, every bullet another prayer. The siege had become more than a military standoff. It was a symbol of the world's collision. East against West, faith against firepower, destiny against survival. The Boxers believed heaven was with them. The foreigners believed civilization itself hung in the balance. And in that burning city, both sides prayed to different gods. Yet both trembled under the same unforgiving sky. The rescue was coming, but so was vengeance. When news of the massacres and the siege in Beijing reached the world's capitals, outrage erupted across Europe, America, and Japan. Newspapers printed shocking headlines: diplomats murdered in China, missionaries slain by fanatics. The great powers, already entrenched in imperial rivalry, suddenly found a common cause: vengeance. Within weeks, an alliance of 8 nations was formed: Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, the United States, Italy, and Austria-Hungary. Each sent warships and soldiers toward the Chinese coast, not merely to rescue their citizens, but to punish what they saw as barbaric defiance. The first to move was a hastily organized force led by British Vice Admiral Edward Seymour. In early June 1900, he assembled nearly 2,000 troops, sailors, Marines, and infantry from multiple nations, and set out from Tianjin toward Beijing by train. They expected a quick journey, perhaps a few days at most. But the Boxers had destroyed the rail lines ahead, forcing the expedition to halt. Soon, thousands of rebels and Qing troops surrounded them. Under constant attack, the Seymour expedition found itself stranded in hostile territory, cut off from supplies and communication. After brutal fighting, the Allied troops were forced to retreat back to Tianjin, battered and bloodied. The mission had failed. Hundreds were dead or wounded. The world now realized that rescuing the foreigners trapped in Beijing would require a far larger force, an invasion of China itself. And so the call went out. Tens of thousands of soldiers from across the globe began to converge on northern China, carrying with them not only rifles and artillery, but the fury of empires. By mid-July 1900, the full weight of the Eight-Nation Alliance had descended upon China. Nearly 20,000 troops landed at Tianjin, where the foreign concessions had become a fortress under siege. The Boxers, joined by Qing regulars, fought fiercely to repel them, but the Allies' modern weaponry, Maxim machine guns, field cannons, and naval bombardments, tore through their defenses. The city burned for days. Streets ran red with blood as foreign soldiers advanced block by block. When Tianjin finally fell, it was left in ruins, its people slaughtered, its walls shattered by shellfire. For the Boxers, this was a holy war. For the Allies, it was a campaign of retribution. Soldiers from different nations marched together under a patchwork of flags. Japanese infantry moved with precision and discipline. British and American troops coordinated artillery fire. Russian Cossacks galloped across the plains, ruthless and unstoppable. The Germans, driven by Kaiser Wilhelm's infamous command to be as ruthless as the Huns, carried out massacres that shocked even other Europeans. Villages suspected of aiding the Boxers were burned, their inhabitants executed without trial. As the Allied army advanced toward Beijing, they left behind a trail of destruction. Thousands of Chinese civilians, many with no connection to the rebellion, were caught in the chaos. To the invaders, every Chinese face looked like an enemy. The Qing Empire, paralyzed by indecision, could only watch as foreign armies marched deeper into its heart. The Empress Dowager Cixi, realizing too late the magnitude of her mistake, began making secret preparations to flee the capital. The empire that had once called itself the center of the world now trembled before the united armies of the West. The march from Tianjin to Beijing was one of the most grueling campaigns of the era. The summer heat was merciless, the roads clogged with refugees, and ambushes lurked around every bend. Yet the Allies pressed forward, driven by vengeance and pride. Along the way, they encountered burned-out villages, Boxer fortresses, and corpses of soldiers and civilians alike. The landscape of northern China had become a scarred wasteland, the physical embodiment of a civilization tearing itself apart. In every captured town, the same grim scenes played out: looting, executions, and acts of revenge. Foreign soldiers, far from home and hardened by battle, unleashed their fury upon a people they scarcely understood. Missionaries, horrified by the slaughter, tried to intervene but were powerless to stop it. The Allied commanders justified their brutality as the price of order, but even within their ranks, whispers of shame began to spread. For some, the campaign had become less about justice and more about conquest. As the Allied forces neared Beijing, scouts reported that the Boxers and Qing troops were fortifying the northern gates. The final showdown was imminent. Inside the city, the besieged foreigners were starving, their ammunition nearly gone. Every day, they prayed for the sound of rescue, the thunder of cannons, the march of soldiers, the sight of their own flags rising above the smoke. On August 4th, 1900, the great Allied army set out for its final push toward Beijing. 20,000 men, dozens of cannons, and the pride of 8 empires moving as one. Their banners fluttered in the scorching wind, and their boots beat a rhythm of vengeance upon the ancient soil of China. Ahead lay the walled capital, the forbidden city, and the empress who had dared to defy the world. The march of retribution had begun, and nothing could stop it now. The sun rose over the northern plains of China like a burning torch. The year was 1900, and the world's mightiest armies were marching toward Beijing. 20,000 men from 8 nations, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, the United States, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, advanced together through the dust and heat. Their goal was clear: to crush the Boxer Rebellion, rescue the besieged foreigners in the Legation Quarter, and punish the Qing Empire for siding with the rebels. The march was relentless. The sound of drums, the clatter of rifles, and the distant thunder of artillery filled the air as columns of soldiers moved through ruined villages and scorched fields. The countryside lay in ruins. Once thriving farmlands were now littered with corpses and ashes. The Boxers had fought bravely but were no match for modern warfare. Their swords and spears were useless against rifles and cannons. Yet even in defeat, they continued to resist with fanatic devotion. Allied scouts reported ambushes along the route. Mobs of peasants charging into machine gun fire, chanting, "Support the Qing, destroy the foreign," as they fell. The soldiers, hardened by weeks of battle, showed no mercy. To them, every Chinese rebel was the same, an enemy to be crushed. By mid-August, the Allied troops were within sight of Beijing's ancient walls. The capital's towering gates, once symbols of imperial majesty, now loomed like a challenge. The defenders, a mix of Qing soldiers and Boxer volunteers, prepared for the inevitable assault. Behind those walls lay the forbidden city, the beating heart of an empire in chaos. And within it, the Empress Dowager Cixi, torn between fear and defiance, awaited the judgment of the world she had provoked. The greatest city in Asia was about to become a battlefield. At dawn on August 14, 1900, the Allied armies launched their attack on Beijing. Each nation raced to capture a different gate, eager to claim the glory of victory. The Japanese targeted the east, the Americans moved toward the south, while the British advanced on the northwestern wall. The Russians, impatient and ruthless, began their assault before dawn, sparking chaos among their allies. Cannon fire thundered across the city as explosions shattered ancient stone. The air filled with the roar of guns and the cries of the dying. The Boxers fought with unmatched desperation. Armed with swords, spears, and faith, they charged into the hail of bullets. Some believed themselves invincible, chanting prayers as they fell. Others fled in terror as artillery shells tore through their ranks. The Qing soldiers fought more cautiously, divided between loyalty to their empire and fear of the foreign armies. Many deserted their posts, while others turned their rifles on their own countrymen, desperate to survive. By midday, the Allied forces had breached the outer defenses. American and British Marines climbed the walls under fire, planting their flags upon the battlements. Japanese troops stormed the eastern gates with precision, cutting through resistance with bayonets. The fighting raged street by street, courtyard by courtyard. Fires consumed the wooden homes, and the smoke blotted out the sun. Beijing, a city of palaces, temples, and centuries of history, had become a battlefield drenched in blood and flame. As the foreign soldiers advanced, they heard the faint echoes of gunfire from the Legation Quarter. The siege was still ongoing. The trapped defenders, starved and nearly out of ammunition, suddenly heard the unmistakable sound of cannons drawing near. Hope, after 55 days of terror, flickered to life once again. The siege of the legations ended on August 14, 1900. The gates burst open as Allied troops fought their way into the foreign quarter. Exhausted defenders emerged from behind barricades, their faces pale, their uniforms tattered, their eyes hollow from hunger and sleepless nights. They had survived the unthinkable, weeks of bombardment, starvation, and fear, and now salvation had arrived. The rescuers were greeted with tears, cheers, and prayers. For the first time in months, the guns fell silent, but the triumph quickly turned dark. Across the rest of Beijing, discipline collapsed. Soldiers from all 8 nations looted homes, temples, and palaces. Priceless artifacts were stolen, women were assaulted, and civilians massacred. The city that had stood for centuries as the heart of Chinese civilization was subjected to the wrath of empire. Foreign troops ransacked the Forbidden City, seizing treasures of gold, jade, and silk. Even the sacred halls of the emperors were not spared. Meanwhile, the Empress Dowager Cixi and the Guangxu Emperor fled the capital disguised as peasants, riding west toward Xi'an. The Dragon Throne stood empty. The Qing Dynasty, once the most powerful empire in the East, had been brought to its knees by both rebellion and invasion. The Allies declared victory, but it was a victory drenched in shame. The city lay in ruins, its people broken, its sovereignty shattered. For the Chinese, the fall of Beijing was not just the defeat of the Boxers. It was the humiliation of a nation. For the foreign powers, it was proof of their dominance, but also a reminder of the brutality that empire demanded. As smoke drifted over the fallen capital, the Boxer Rebellion had reached its tragic climax. Yet the war was not over. The reckoning and the price of rebellion was still to come. As the Allied cannons thundered outside Beijing's walls, the Forbidden City trembled under the weight of history. Inside its crimson halls, the Empress Dowager Cixi, the most powerful woman in China, sat beneath a golden dragon canopy, her mind racing. For weeks she had believed the spirits of the Boxers would protect her empire from foreign invasion. Now, as the sound of gunfire drew closer, she realized the truth. The dynasty stood on the brink of collapse. Her advisors whispered conflicting plans: to fight to the end, to negotiate peace, or to flee into the countryside. At last, Cixi made her decision. The Dragon Throne would not fall into foreign hands. She would live to rule another day. Before dawn on August 15th, 1900, the Forbidden City stirred in silence. Servants gathered jewels, scrolls, and imperial seals while eunuchs disguised the Empress and the Emperor in peasant robes. Cixi, once draped in silk and gold, now wore rough linen, her hair hidden beneath a straw hat. The Guangxu Emperor, frail and defeated, followed behind her. Under cover of darkness, the imperial convoy slipped out through the west gate, guarded by loyal troops and a handful of trusted eunuchs. They traveled by carriage at first, but soon the roads became choked with refugees fleeing the advancing armies. The once great rulers of China found themselves jostled among the common people. Farmers, mothers, and beggars, all running from the same enemy. The Empress looked back once at the dim outline of Beijing's walls, faintly glowing under a blood-red sky. Smoke rose from the palaces she had ruled for decades. The Forbidden City, her kingdom of splendor, was lost. Ahead lay the barren plains of northern China, and beyond them, the uncertain safety of Xi'an. The journey would be long, harsh, and humbling. Yet within Cixi's heart, the fire of survival still burned. The imperial entourage moved westward through a land ravaged by war. Villages lay in ashes, and corpses lined the roadside. The peasants who once revered the Qing dynasty now looked upon the fleeing court with cold indifference or quiet anger. The empire had failed to protect them, and now even the Son of Heaven was running like a hunted animal. The Empress's convoy, stripped of its grandeur, advanced slowly under the scorching sun. They rode on borrowed horses, ate coarse millet, and slept beneath tattered tents. Every mile was a reminder of how far the dynasty had fallen. Bandits roamed the countryside, emboldened by chaos. Several times, the imperial guards fought off raiders who mistook the disguised nobles for wealthy travelers. Cixi, though weary, remained calm. Her composure amazed those around her. "If heaven tests me," she reportedly said, "it is because I am still chosen to lead." She believed survival was proof of her divine mandate. Even in disgrace, she saw herself as the protector of China's soul. Along the road, the Empress received word of Beijing's fate. The Allied armies had taken the city, looted its palaces, and desecrated its temples. Foreign soldiers paraded through the streets, their flags flying over imperial gates. Thousands of civilians had been killed or enslaved. The forbidden city itself had been entered by foreigners, an act of unimaginable humiliation. Cixi clenched her fists as she heard the reports. "They have touched what is sacred," she whispered. "They will pay the price." Her anger hardened into resolve. The Empress Dowager might have lost her capital, but she would not lose her dynasty. From exile, she would rebuild her power, just as she had done before. The road to Xi'an was not a retreat. It was a passage toward revenge. After weeks of hardship, the imperial convoy reached Xi'an in late September 1900. The ancient city, once a capital of past dynasties, became the temporary refuge of the Qing court. The Empress and the Emperor took up residence in the governor's mansion, where silk banners replaced straw mats and the illusion of royal dignity was restored. Yet beneath the surface, the court was haunted by fear and division. Ministers argued over how to deal with the foreign powers. Some urged immediate surrender. Others called for continued resistance. The Empress listened to them all, her expression unreadable. Cixi understood that the empire's survival depended not on war, but on negotiation. From Xi'an, she sent secret envoys to the foreign generals in Beijing, offering peace in exchange for the dynasty's preservation. The Allied powers, weary of the campaign and wary of ruling a vast hostile nation, accepted her overtures. For them, punishing China had been a demonstration of strength, not a mission of conquest. They would demand reparations, territory, and concessions, but they would allow the Qing throne to endure. As winter settled over Xi'an, the Empress began to rebuild her authority. She issued decrees condemning the Boxers, portraying herself as a victim of their fanaticism rather than their patron. The court's historians quietly rewrote the story, shifting blame away from the throne. The surviving officials bowed and obeyed, pretending to believe the new version of events. Yet deep within her heart, Cixi knew the truth. The Boxer Rebellion had been her gamble, a desperate attempt to drive out the foreigners and reclaim China's pride. Instead, it had exposed her empire's weakness to the world. As snow fell over the city walls, the Empress looked toward the east, imagining the ruins of Beijing. "The dragon still breathes," she murmured, "but its wings are broken." The Qing dynasty had survived, but its spirit was forever scarred. In the aftermath of Beijing's fall, the city that once symbolized the heart of the Chinese Empire now lay in foreign hands. Smoke still curled from the blackened rooftops, and the streets were littered with rubble and corpses. The scent of gunpowder and decay lingered in the air. Allied soldiers from 8 nations patrolled the city's narrow alleys, their uniforms a kaleidoscope of colors: khaki, blue, gray, and white, each representing a different empire that had come to claim victory. The red and white banners of Japan fluttered beside the Union Jack of Britain, the stars and stripes of America, and the tricolor of France. Beijing, for the first time in its 1,000-year history, had become a city under occupation. The foreign commanders divided the capital into zones of control. The Russians seized the north, including the imperial city gates. The British took the west, the Americans the south, and the Japanese the east. Each power acted like a conqueror, imposing its own rules and extracting its own share of spoils. Soldiers marched in drills through the imperial courtyards, their boots echoing against the ancient stone floors once reserved for emperors. Western engineers began surveying the streets, planning telegraph lines, railway extensions, and new fortifications. It was as if they meant to remake the ancient city in their image. The Chinese people watched in silence, their resentment buried beneath fear. Anyone suspected of aiding the Boxers was executed without trial. Entire districts were looted, temples desecrated, and families destroyed. Churches, once burned by Boxers, were rebuilt under the guard of foreign bayonets. Missionaries returned, proclaiming the triumph of Christianity over superstition. Meanwhile, the Legation Quarter, where the foreigners had been besieged for 55 days, was rebuilt as a fortress, surrounded by high walls and guarded by permanent garrisons. It became a foreign colony in the middle of China's capital. The humiliation was complete. The Dragon Throne might still exist in exile, but Beijing now belonged to the victors. In the months following the Allied victory, a grim campaign of punishment began. The foreign generals announced that justice must be served for the deaths of missionaries, diplomats, and civilians during the Boxer Uprising. Yet what followed was not justice, it was vengeance. Allied troops swept across northern China, burning villages and executing anyone suspected of rebellion. Towns were forced to pay heavy fines, and their leaders were hanged or beheaded in public squares. The message was clear: resistance to the foreign powers would never be tolerated again. In Beijing, courts of military justice were established under the authority of the occupation forces. Chinese officials accused of supporting the Boxers were arrested, interrogated, and often executed. Some were tortured into confessions they never made. Qing nobles who had once shouted, "Support the Boxers," now pleaded for mercy, insisting they had been deceived. A few, like Prince Duan, one of the rebellion's fiercest supporters, refused to recant and were condemned to death. The executions were staged as public spectacles to remind the Chinese people who now ruled their destiny. Even temples and monasteries, once sanctuaries of peace, became scenes of terror. Foreign soldiers stormed through the sacred halls, seizing golden statues and smashing altars. Priceless relics were loaded onto wagons and shipped overseas. In Europe, museums would soon boast of treasures from Peking. But in China, those same treasures were the ashes of pride. Amid the chaos, some missionaries tried to show compassion, feeding the poor and sheltering orphans. Yet even their efforts could not erase the bitterness. The Boxer Rebellion had begun as a desperate cry against foreign domination. Now it had ended in an even deeper submission. Across China, the people whispered that heaven itself had turned its back on the Qing dynasty. The mandate of heaven, once believed to guide emperors, seemed to have passed to the foreign devils who now ruled their streets. By early 1901, Beijing had become a playground for imperial ambition. Every nation sought to profit from China's defeat. Lavish banquets were held in the captured palaces, where generals and diplomats toasted to victory while Chinese servants poured their wine. Newspapers in London, Paris, and Tokyo printed triumphant headlines, celebrating the civilization of China. Behind the polished speeches and elegant uniforms, however, greed ruled. Each nation demanded its share of reparations, its own sphere of influence, and its slice of the fallen empire. The foreign diplomats met daily in the Legation Quarter, turning Beijing into an international bargaining table. They debated how much silver China should pay, how many forts should be destroyed, and what privileges their merchants would gain. The Qing Empire, humiliated and absent from these meetings, had no voice in deciding its fate. Even as the Empress Dowager plotted her return from Xi'an, her empire was being divided like spoils of war. Meanwhile, ordinary life in Beijing remained trapped in misery. Thousands of women were widowed, children orphaned, and homes reduced to rubble. Foreign patrols enforced curfews. Anyone caught outside at night could be shot. The city that had once glowed with the lanterns of 1,000 festivals now lay in darkness, its silence broken only by the marching of boots. Yet beneath the despair, seeds of change began to grow. Chinese scholars and reformists, horrified by the nation's defeat, started asking dangerous questions. Why had their empire, with its long and glorious history, fallen to foreign powers? Could China be reborn through reform, education, and modernization? The Boxer Rebellion had failed, but its fire still burned. Not in rebellion against the world, but in a new determination to rebuild it. As spring approached, the foreign flags continued to wave over Beijing's walls. The occupation seemed unshakable, but history, like the tides, never remains still. The humiliation of 1900 would not be forgotten, and from it, a new China would one day rise. By early 1901, the guns had fallen silent, but China's wounds ran deep. Across the north, entire provinces lay in ruins. Villages were empty, crops untended, and cities haunted by ghosts of those who had died. The Qing Empire, once the most powerful in Asia, stood humiliated before the world. The Empress Dowager Cixi, still in exile at Xi'an, understood that the time for resistance had passed. To save what remained of her dynasty, she had to accept the foreign powers' terms, no matter how severe. The negotiations took place in Beijing, now under foreign occupation. Representing the Qing government were a few cautious officials, led by Li Hongzhang, the empire's most experienced diplomat. A veteran of China's many humiliations, Li had already signed the Treaty of Shimonoseki after the war with Japan. Now, he faced an even grimmer task: to sign away China's dignity once again. Around him sat the representatives of the Eight-Nation Alliance: Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, the United States, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, men who saw themselves as the judges of the fallen empire. The demands were staggering. The foreign powers wanted punishment for every death, every insult, and every act of defiance committed during the rebellion. They wanted the destruction of Chinese forts, the execution of Boxer leaders, and the payment of massive reparations. Li Hongzhang pleaded for mercy, arguing that the empire was already devastated and could not bear more suffering. But the diplomats were unmoved. They saw China as both guilty and weak, a country that must be taught a lasting lesson. For months, negotiations dragged on. While diplomats haggled over silver and sovereignty, the people starved. Refugees wandered the roads, and famine spread across the countryside. When news of the proposed treaty reached Xi'an, Cixi's court was divided. Some argued that it was better to die than submit. Others said survival was the only path forward. In the end, Cixi chose survival. An empire can be rebuilt, she said, but death is final. Her words sealed China's fate on September 7, 1901. The Treaty of Xinqiu, known to the world as the Boxer Protocol, was signed. It was one of the harshest agreements ever imposed on a sovereign nation. China was ordered to pay 450 million taels of silver in reparations to the Eight Powers, an amount so vast it would take 39 years to repay, with interest. To guarantee payment, the revenues from China's salt tax, customs duties, and other national income were placed under foreign control. The empire had effectively mortgaged its future. But money was not the only punishment. The The Boxer Protocol also demanded executions. High-ranking officials who had supported the Boxers were to be executed or exiled. Public beheadings took place across the provinces as Qing governors sought to prove their loyalty to the victors. The once proud imperial officials now acted as executioners of their own people. Temples and shrines that had hosted Boxer gatherings were torn down, replaced by stone memorials honoring the foreigners who had died. The treaty also granted the Allied powers the right to station troops permanently in Beijing and along the route to the sea. The Legation Quarter was fortified with walls and cannons, a foreign enclave at the heart of China's capital. Foreign soldiers marched through the streets where once only imperial guards had trod. The Chinese police were forbidden to enter without permission. Beijing, the seat of the Dragon Throne, was now guarded by outsiders. Even symbolic gestures of submission were required. The Qing government was forced to send envoys to Germany and Japan to express official sorrow for the deaths of their diplomats. A German monument was erected in Beijing to honor Baron von Ketteler, the envoy killed by Boxers, while the graves of thousands of Chinese rebels remained unmarked. The humiliation was total. For the Western world, the Boxer Protocol was a triumph of order over chaos. For China, it was the lowest point in a century of humiliation. In January 1902, nearly a year and a half after fleeing Beijing, the Empress Dowager Cixi returned to her capital. Her procession was grand and ceremonial, but beneath the surface, the empire she returned to rule was no longer her own. Foreign troops lined the roads as her carriage passed. The flags of foreign nations fluttered over the city walls. Beijing was no longer the forbidden city of her youth. It was a city shared with the conquerors. Cixi, however, refused to appear defeated. She restored her court with renewed splendor, reopening the forbidden city and resuming imperial rituals as if nothing had changed. But she knew the truth. The Qing dynasty had lost its authority, and the foreign powers would now shape China's destiny. In private, she lamented the rebellion's failure but blamed others for its consequences. "I wanted to save the empire," she reportedly said, "but heaven decreed otherwise." Despite the humiliation, the empress began to see the need for change. She ordered the end of the traditional examination system, encouraged the study of foreign sciences, and sent students abroad. The Boxer Rebellion had shown that China could not survive in isolation. If the empire was to endure, it would have to modernize, not with swords and superstitions, but with knowledge and reform. Still, her reforms came too late. The Boxer Protocol had drained the treasury, crippled the army, and shattered the people's faith in the dynasty. In the countryside, secret societies whispered of revolution. Among the young and educated, a new idea began to spread, that China needed not just reform but rebirth. As the empress looked out across the frozen courtyards of the Forbidden City, she could sense the shifting winds of history. The Boxers were gone, the foreigners triumphant, and the old order dying. Yet within the sorrow of defeat lay the faint pulse of a future yet to come. The Boxer Rebellion had ended, but its echoes would shape China's destiny for generations. By 1902, China lay in ruins. The Boxer Rebellion had been crushed, the Qing dynasty humbled, and Beijing occupied by foreign troops. The streets that once echoed with the footsteps of emperors now resounded with the boots of soldiers from 8 foreign nations. Markets had been destroyed, temples desecrated, and villages emptied. The countryside was a landscape of famine, fire, and fear. Millions of peasants had perished, while countless others fled to avoid the wrath of both the Boxers and the invading armies. The empire's treasury had been emptied to pay reparations under the Boxer Protocol, and foreign powers effectively controlled trade, taxation, and military oversight. The people's faith in the Qing dynasty was shattered. Once revered as the divine rulers of China, the Emperor and Empress Dowager Cixi had fled the capital while foreign guns raged around them. Ordinary citizens whispered that heaven had abandoned the throne. Secret societies, previously suppressed, now spread their messages in hushed tones. The humiliation of the Boxer Rebellion became the story parents told their children, not as history but as a warning that the old ways were no longer sufficient to protect China. Scholars in Beijing, Shanghai, and other cities debated fiercely in private, asking whether the empire could survive or if a revolution was inevitable. In urban centers, students and intellectuals began to study Western ideas of governance, military organization, and technology. They saw the rapid modernization of Japan following the Meiji Restoration and wondered why China, with its rich history and vast population, had fallen behind. The Boxer Rebellion had been a desperate attempt to expel foreigners by faith and force. It had failed catastrophically. It became increasingly clear that survival required knowledge, discipline, and reform, not superstition and ritual. The seeds of revolution were sown in the hearts of the young, who had witnessed both the empire's humiliation and the foreign powers' might firsthand. While the Empress Dowager Cixi attempted to modernize the Qing court with limited reforms, her efforts were constrained by the dynasty's weakened position. She encouraged the study of Western military techniques and sent students abroad to learn science and diplomacy. Yet the changes were too slow, too cautious, and too tied to the survival of a dynasty that the people increasingly distrusted. Reformers argued for the abolition of outdated Confucian examinations, the adoption of modern schools, and the development of industry. But radicals went further, calling for the overthrow of the Qing entirely. Sun Yat-sen, then a young revolutionary, traveled abroad seeking support for the cause of a republic. Inspired by China's humiliation at the hands of foreign powers, he argued that only by replacing the Manchu dynasty could China regain sovereignty and dignity. Across the provinces, underground movements quietly organized, secret societies, student clubs, and anti-Qing militias all shared a vision: a modern, independent China free from both foreign domination and imperial stagnation. The failures of the Boxer Rebellion had demonstrated that blind faith in tradition could no longer protect the nation. Meanwhile, the memory of the Allied occupation fueled anger and resentment. Villages that had been burned by foreign troops spread stories of atrocities, amplifying anti-foreign sentiment. The Boxers themselves, though crushed, had left behind an enduring symbol of resistance: the idea that ordinary citizens could rise against invaders and corrupt rulers alike. Reformers and radicals drew inspiration from this, blending nationalist fervor with revolutionary strategy. In cities like Shanghai and Guangzhou, newspapers printed essays criticizing the dynasty, exposing foreign exploitation, and calling for political reform. The seeds planted by the Boxer Rebellion were growing, not into superstition, but into a nationwide movement for transformation. By the mid-1900s, the Qing dynasty survived in name only. Empress Dowager Cixi remained a figurehead of authority, her return to Beijing following the Boxer Rebellion providing only an illusion of stability. Her limited reforms could not prevent the spread of revolutionary ideas. Across China, youth organizations, secret societies, and emerging political parties studied the failures of the Boxers as lessons. Faith and ritual alone could not stop the tide of foreign intrusion. Knowledge, unity, and strategy were essential. The Boxer Rebellion left a paradoxical legacy. On one hand, it had been a devastating failure: millions dead, cities destroyed, and China humiliated on the world stage. On the other hand, it ignited the consciousness of a generation. Young intellectuals, reformers, and revolutionaries now understood the power of collective action, the importance of modernization, and the urgency of sovereignty. The rebellion became a symbol of both resistance and the dangers of unpreparedness. Foreign powers, meanwhile, imposed their control but underestimated the resilience of the Chinese people. The occupation, reparations, and treaties could not crush the desire for autonomy and dignity. Over time, the memory of 1900, the sieges, the executions, and the humiliation would fuel the revolutionary fervor that ultimately led to the collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1911. The Boxer Rebellion, though defeated, had planted the seeds for the transformation of China into a nation determined to reclaim its place in the modern world. The embers of revolt and reform now glowed in the hearts of millions. From the ashes of destruction, a new China was slowly beginning to rise, one that would never again accept humiliation in silence. After the fall of Beijing and the signing of the Boxer Protocol, the victors turned their attention to retribution. The Allies demanded that the Qing government punish those responsible for the rebellion, including Boxer leaders, sympathetic officials, and military commanders who had aided the insurgents. The Qing court, already weakened and humiliated, complied under duress. The process was formal in appearance, yet brutal in practice, blending law, vengeance, and symbolism into a campaign meant to assert foreign dominance. High-ranking Boxer leaders were rounded up from across northern China. Many had survived the battles, hiding among sympathetic peasants, while others had fled to remote provinces. They were brought to Beijing under armed guard, where foreign observers insisted on overseeing their fate. Trials were conducted in makeshift courtrooms within the Legation Quarter. The accused were often denied legal representation, and confessions were extracted through threats and intimidation. The purpose of the trials was as much to terrify as to punish. The Boxers, once emboldened by visions of divine protection, were now shackled, humiliated, and paraded before a world they had sought to repel. Execution was common. Some Boxer leaders were beheaded in public squares, their deaths meant to serve as warnings to others who might challenge foreign authority. Others were executed by firing squads, watched by foreign troops and surviving civilians alike. The punishment was thorough. Families of prominent Boxers were often punished as well, property confiscated, and villages blamed for harboring rebels were razed. It was a calculated display, a demonstration that rebellion against both the Qing court's weakened authority and foreign powers would not be tolerated. The message was clear. The era of traditional, faith-driven resistance had ended. While the Boxers faced execution, Qing officials who had supported or failed to restrain the rebellion also suffered severe consequences. Prince Duan, a high-ranking member of the imperial family and ardent supporter of the Boxers, was among those arrested. His personal influence and patronage had lent legitimacy to the uprising. The foreign powers demanded that he and other officials be punished as a demonstration that even the highest ranks of the Qing dynasty were not immune to accountability. Executions of these officials were often public and ceremonial. Some were forced to kneel before foreign observers as their sentences were read aloud, a symbolic act designed to humiliate those who had once wielded power. Property was confiscated, and heirs of disgraced officials were stripped of titles. In addition, governors and generals who had sided with the Boxers were dismissed from office, and some were imprisoned or exiled to remote regions. These actions served multiple purposes. They punished the guilty, deterred future insurrections, and reassured foreign powers that China would remain submissive and compliant. Yet not all officials faced death. Some negotiated their survival by cooperating with the victors and providing intelligence on remaining rebel activity. Others bribed foreign commanders or offered hostages to avoid execution. The Qing dynasty, though deeply weakened, still possessed a bureaucratic machinery capable of selectively negotiating its survival. Nevertheless, the punishments instilled fear throughout the empire. Civil servants, military commanders, and regional governors now understood that loyalty to the dynasty was conditional, and that any support for anti-foreign movements would carry lethal consequences. The Qing court had been publicly shamed, and the punishment of boxers and officials cemented foreign dominance in northern China. The repercussions of these punishments extended far beyond Beijing. In rural areas, peasants recounted stories of mass executions, looted villages, and decimated communities. Families that had supported the boxers now lived in terror, hiding from both the foreign soldiers and the local authorities enforcing the Boxer Protocol. Entire towns were depopulated, and social structures were disrupted for decades. Villages that had once resisted foreign intrusion were now economically crippled, their agricultural production destroyed, leaving famine and poverty in their wake. This climate of fear served as a tool of control. Ordinary citizens, witnessing the brutal consequences of rebellion, were forced to submit to the Qing court's weakened but obedient administration and to the foreign powers' supervision. Schools were reopened under foreign guidance, temples were monitored, and the boxers' traditions and rituals were banned. The cultural and religious practices that had fueled the rebellion were suppressed in favor of modernization and control. Yet beneath the surface, resentment simmered. While the rebellion had failed, and punishment had been severe, stories of boxer courage, devotion, and defiance endured in folk memory. Families whispered tales of heroism at night. Secret societies kept their networks alive, teaching the next generation about resistance. The punishments of 1901, designed to crush spirit and enforce compliance, inadvertently helped create a legacy of enduring anti-foreign sentiment. The Boxer Rebellion had ended, but its fire, though temporarily buried beneath fear and ashes, would continue to burn in the hearts of the Chinese people, setting the stage for future reform and revolution. The crushing defeat of 1900 to 1901 left the Qing military in ruins. The once mighty banners of the empire had been humiliated by foreign troops armed with rifles, artillery, and modern tactics. Traditional soldiers, armed with swords, spears, and outdated muskets, had fallen like wheat before a storm of bullets and cannons. Entire regiments had been decimated in battles outside Tianjin and Beijing, while the surviving officers returned home broken, questioning the very strategies they had been trained to follow. The defeat exposed not only the weaknesses of the Qing army, but also the systemic failures of the dynasty itself. Outdated logistics, poor communication, and a rigid hierarchy that resisted innovation. Empress Dowager Cixi, acutely aware that China's survival depended on modernization, began to take cautious measures. Rebuilding the army became a national priority. Military advisors were brought from Japan and Europe to train new regiments, emphasizing modern drills, artillery usage, and combined arms operations. Factories were commissioned to produce rifles, cannons, and ammunition within China, though quality was often inferior to Western imports. Academies were opened to educate officers in modern strategy, engineering, and medicine. Slowly, the Qing army began to transform from a ceremonial, traditional force into one capable of facing contemporary armies. Yet the shadow of past defeat lingered over every soldier. The lessons of the Boxer Rebellion were etched in every corner of the empire. In provincial towns, veteran officers drilled peasants into new militias capable of defending against foreign intrusion. In the capital, the Empress oversaw detailed reports on troop readiness, supply chains, and defensive strategies. She understood that the days of relying on faith, superstition, or loyalty alone were gone. Modern weapons, disciplined training, and strategic planning were the only means to preserve the dynasty and restore China's credibility. Even as she cautiously modernized, however, Cixi remained conservative politically, fearful that too much change could destabilize her fragile rule. Rebuilding the army was only part of a broader vision of modernization. Following the devastation of the Boxer Rebellion, the Qing court recognized that economic and technological reform was essential to prevent further humiliation. Railroads, telegraph lines, and modern ports became priority projects, supported in part by foreign loans, though these loans further deepened the empire's dependency. Shipyards were expanded, coastal defenses reinforced, and arsenals modernized to produce rifles and ammunition domestically. Education reform was closely tied to military modernization. Schools for science, engineering, and Western studies were opened in major cities such as Beijing, Shanghai, and Tianjin. Young officers were sent abroad to Japan, Germany, and the United States to study modern military tactics and industrial technology. The logic was clear. A nation could not defend itself with faith alone, and surviving the aftermath of the Boxer Rebellion meant embracing knowledge as power. Despite these efforts, obstacles were abundant. Corruption, bureaucratic inertia, and resistance from conservative mandarins slowed progress. Many reforms were superficial, designed to impress foreign observers rather than create genuine military or industrial strength. Still, even modest advances represented a profound shift in China's approach to governance and defense. The lessons of the Boxer Rebellion, the devastating combination of foreign military power, internal weakness, and mismanaged resistance, would resonate across every level of Chinese society, shaping reformist thinking and future revolutionary planning for decades to come. The aftermath of the Boxer Rebellion did more than destroy armies and cities. It reshaped the Chinese consciousness. The humiliations suffered, from foreign occupation to the execution of boxers and officials, to the enforced indemnities and occupation of Beijing, left deep scars in the psyche of the Chinese people. These scars fueled a new awareness of the need for national unity, sovereignty, and modernization. Intellectuals and young reformers began to conceptualize China not merely as an empire ruled by a dynasty, but as a nation that required a capable government, disciplined military, and educated populace. Nationalism began to emerge alongside modernization. The failures of the Boxer Rebellion highlighted the dangers of blind allegiance to superstition and the inadequacy of relying solely on imperial authority. Reformers, radical thinkers, and students began organizing movements that would, in the coming decade, lay the foundation for the 1911 revolution. Secret societies, once peripheral in rural areas, gained new ideological vigor, emphasizing resistance to foreign domination and the need for systemic reform. Even peasants who had survived the violence of the Boxer Rebellion shared stories of heroism, sacrifice, and defiance, forming a folk memory that strengthened national identity. The Empress Dowager's reforms, while limited and conservative, intersected with these grassroots movements. Education, industrialization, and military modernization created the tools necessary for a new kind of Chinese resilience. By 1910, a decade after the Boxer Rebellion, China was no longer the isolated, superstitious empire it had been. The flames of 1900 had burned, but from the ashes, a new awareness of national strength, reform, and unity had begun to grow. A prelude to revolution, change, and the eventual end of dynastic rule. The Boxer Rebellion's failure, while catastrophic, had set the stage for China's rebirth in the modern era. The signing of the Boxer Protocol in 1901 brought not only humiliation but a staggering financial burden to the Qing dynasty. China was ordered to pay 450 million taels of silver to the 8 foreign powers: Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, the United States, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, over a period of 39 years with interest. To put it into perspective, this sum represented a crippling portion of the empire's annual revenue, enough to cripple provincial economies, drain the treasury, and impose unbearable taxes on the population. The burden of indemnity fell directly upon the Chinese people. Villagers who had survived the fighting were forced to pay excessive taxes to fund the reparations. Grain and salt taxes, already substantial, were doubled or tripled in some regions. Local officials, desperate to collect silver to meet foreign demands, often resorted to coercion and violence, enforcing tribute through brutal measures. Families who could not pay were stripped of property, forced into labor, or even sold into servitude. The countryside, already devastated by Boxer violence and famine, became a landscape of economic misery, with farmers unable to recover crops or rebuild homes. Even in the capital, Beijing, the financial strain was obvious. The Qing court, already weakened politically and militarily, was now tasked with managing not only reconstruction of destroyed districts, but also the collection and shipment of silver to foreign powers. The treasury, depleted by war and occupation, had little reserve. Loans from foreign banks became necessary, further entangling China in a web of dependency. Each shipment of silver sent abroad was a reminder of defeat, a tangible payment for humiliation, and a symbol of the empire's inability to defend its sovereignty. The financial burden extended far beyond Beijing. Provinces across northern and eastern China suffered dramatically under the reparations. Farmers struggled to pay the raised taxes, leading to widespread abandonment of farmland and a sharp decline in agricultural production. Villages that had once been self-sufficient were forced to sell whatever they could, often under duress or at low prices to local intermediaries. Many peasants migrated to cities seeking work, swelling urban populations and creating further social strain. Trade and commerce also suffered. Merchants faced new taxes, confiscations, and restrictions imposed by both Qing authorities and foreign powers. Cities that had been economic hubs experienced stagnation as silver flowed to the foreign powers rather than circulating within local economies. The economic impact was compounded by inflation, as the demand for hard currency to meet indemnity payments increased its scarcity and drove up prices for everyday goods. Poverty and famine spread, and the discontent fueled social unrest. Minor uprisings and protests erupted in scattered provinces, though they were suppressed by Qing troops who were now better trained but still underpaid and demoralized. The foreign powers, while focused on collecting reparations, also leveraged their financial control to expand economic influence. They demanded access to Chinese ports, control over customs, and preferential treatment for their merchants. By tying China's economy to the repayment schedule of the Boxer indemnity, the Western nations ensured a form of semi-colonial influence that limited the Qing dynasty's ability to govern independently. The financial strain, therefore, was not just a domestic problem. It became a tool of geopolitical control that shaped China's economy and sovereignty for decades. The social consequences of the reparations were profound. Ordinary people, already traumatized by the violence of the Boxer Rebellion, now faced economic despair. Families were torn apart, children left to beg in the streets, and elderly citizens forced into labor to meet tax demands. The punishment of the elite officials and boxers, coupled with the financial burden on the masses, created an atmosphere of deep resentment toward both the Qing dynasty and the foreign powers. People no longer saw their rulers as protectors. Instead, the government appeared weak, complicit, and incapable of defending national dignity. This resentment fueled the growth of reformist and revolutionary movements. Scholars, merchants, and students debated how China could survive in the modern world. Nationalist sentiments spread through clandestine societies, urging the populace to resist foreign domination, reject corrupt officials, and modernize the nation. The financial drain caused by reparations underscored the need for industrialization, modernization of taxation, and economic self-sufficiency. For many, the humiliation of the Boxer Rebellion and the economic burden that followed were inseparable, proof that China's survival required both political and technological transformation. Even decades later, the Boxer indemnities remained a symbol of foreign exploitation and imperial weakness. They became rallying points in nationalist rhetoric, cited by reformers and revolutionaries as evidence that the Qing dynasty had failed its people. Villagers and townsfolk passed down stories of financial ruin, foreign greed, and governmental impotence, narratives that fed the growing fire of anti-Qing and anti-foreign sentiment. The Boxer Rebellion's military defeat had been devastating, but its financial consequences ensured that the memory of 1900 would echo through Chinese society for generations, shaping the social, political, and economic discourse for decades to come. The Boxer Rebellion left a profound mark on Chinese culture, exposing the fragility of long-held traditions in the face of foreign influence and modern warfare. The Boxers themselves had relied on centuries-old spiritual practices, claiming invulnerability to bullets and divine protection. Their rituals, martial displays, invocations, and secret rites reflected a worldview that blended folk religion, Confucian loyalty, and millenarian belief. Yet the failure of the rebellion shattered the notion that tradition alone could defend the nation. People across northern China, who had once revered these practices, now faced the harsh reality of foreign technology, disciplined armies, and modern strategy. The collapse of faith-based resistance also prompted intellectual and social questioning. Scholars debated whether Confucian orthodoxy, which had dominated education, governance, and societal morality for centuries, was sufficient to address China's modern challenges. Texts on Western science, military tactics, and political theory began circulating clandestinely, often smuggled into provinces by reformers and students returning from abroad. The populace, still traumatized by the violence and executions, increasingly recognized that survival in a world dominated by industrialized nations required adaptation. Folk traditions and spiritual practices were not discarded overnight, but the cultural confidence that had once underpinned resistance was deeply shaken. Temples and shrines that had supported Boxer activities were destroyed or repurposed under foreign supervision, erasing symbols of the uprising from public life. Local festivals and martial arts schools were closely monitored to prevent new rebellions. In rural areas, elders struggled to explain the failure of practices that had once been considered sacred. Children, raised amidst the ruins of their communities, learned that ancestral customs could not stop foreign rifles. The cultural landscape of China had shifted dramatically. Faith, once central to the nation's identity, was now accompanied by an urgent call for modernization, education, and reform. Though the rebellion failed militarily, anti-foreign sentiment intensified in its aftermath. Ordinary citizens witnessed the brutality of foreign occupation, looting, and executions, embedding lasting resentment toward outsiders. The Allied forces had demonstrated their superior military power, but in doing so, they also alienated the very population they claimed to civilize or protect. Stories of massacres, property confiscation, and humiliation of local officials spread through villages, fueling narratives of oppression and injustice. Even in cities, foreign-controlled quarters created visual reminders of subjugation. Western flags flew over once imperial gates, troops marched through streets, and foreign merchants operated with privileges denied to locals. Intellectuals and reformers harnessed this resentment, blending it with calls for modernization and national sovereignty. Newspapers, pamphlets, and clandestine writings circulated throughout urban centers, criticizing both foreign exploitation and Qing incompetence. The memory of foreign occupation became a political tool, highlighting the consequences of a weak military and stagnant bureaucracy. Nationalist societies, inspired by the failure of the Boxers and the humiliation of Beijing, spread messages emphasizing the need for unity, technological advancement, and military reform. Anti-foreign sentiment became intertwined with anti-Qing sentiment. Many concluded that the dynasty had failed in its most sacred duty, protecting the nation and its people. Even popular culture reflected this anger. Folk songs, theatrical performances, and storytelling celebrated the courage of the Boxers, while lamenting the betrayal by corrupt officials and the devastation wrought by foreign powers. These cultural expressions, often oral rather than written, preserved collective memory and helped maintain a sense of identity, pride, and resistance, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. Anti-foreign sentiment, once expressed solely through martial rebellion, now found voice in education, literature, and social discourse, shaping China's ideological landscape for decades to come. The aftermath of the Boxer Rebellion prompted a broader reassessment of Chinese culture itself. The catastrophic failure of a movement rooted in traditional spiritual beliefs forced leaders, scholars, and ordinary citizens to confront the limitations of old practices. Modernization was no longer merely an option. It became an urgent necessity. Military, industrial, and educational reforms were intertwined with cultural change. Martial arts schools adapted to modern techniques, religious practices were scrutinized, and Confucian education was supplemented with science and engineering. For intellectuals, the cultural impact of the rebellion provided both a warning and an opportunity. While faith-based resistance had failed, lessons from the Boxers' courage and grassroots organization were incorporated into revolutionary thinking. Nationalism emerged not merely as political ideology, but as a cultural movement, emphasizing unity, knowledge, and the defense of the nation against foreign domination. Students studied foreign languages, technology, and political systems, seeking tools to strengthen China while retaining a sense of national identity. In everyday life, communities began balancing tradition with adaptation. Rural villages incorporated Western agricultural techniques alongside ancient farming methods. Cities built modern infrastructure while retaining traditional architecture. The Boxer Rebellion, though devastating, had forced China to confront its vulnerabilities, creating a cultural shift that would influence the country's trajectory well into the 20th century. Anti-foreign sentiment, tempered by pragmatism, became a driving force behind modernization, revolution, and the eventual birth of a new, modern Chinese nation-state. Following the fall of Beijing in 1900, the city became the epicenter of international military control. Soldiers from 8 foreign nations, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, the United States, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, marched through the streets, their presence a constant reminder of China's defeat. Each nation controlled a distinct sector of the city, creating a patchwork of foreign jurisdiction that transformed Beijing from a sovereign capital into a complex, occupied metropolis. Soldiers patrolled every alley, checkpoint, and market, enforcing curfews and monitoring the movements of civilians. The Legation Quarter, where diplomats and missionaries had endured the 55-day siege, became a heavily fortified stronghold. Its walls were reinforced, artillery installed, and guards stationed permanently to prevent any future uprisings. Foreign military engineers reconstructed sections of the city, building roads, barracks, and communication lines in accordance with European standards. Within weeks, Beijing had become a city that reflected both Chinese tradition and foreign military precision. The presence of these troops was not only a practical measure to enforce order, but also a psychological statement. The empire's capital now lay under the eyes of outsiders, and the Qing government was powerless to intervene. The occupation was a cultural shock for Beijing's residents. Streets once dominated by imperial guards now echoed with foreign languages, shouted commands, and the clanging of foreign boots on stone. Markets operated under surveillance, religious rituals were restricted, and the population's movements were tightly controlled. The local population learned quickly that the era of self-rule, even within their own capital, had ended. The foreign soldiers, while not constantly violent, were symbols of dominance, their uniforms and discipline asserting authority over a city whose rulers had fled in fear. Life in Beijing under international occupation was characterized by a mix of fear, resentment, and forced adaptation. Ordinary citizens were subject to strict regulations. Curfews limited mobility after dark, assembly of more than a few individuals was prohibited, and public gatherings were closely monitored. Checkpoints controlled entry to the Legation Quarter, markets, and government buildings, ensuring that foreign authorities maintained the upper hand. Even the Qing administration was subordinated. Officials needed permission to enter certain areas, and any perceived disobedience could result in immediate arrest or public reprimand. The foreign troops themselves had contrasting objectives. While maintaining security, they also sought to assert influence, protect their economic interests, and prevent further uprisings. Western officers conducted drills, parades, and inspections, often inviting locals to witness displays of military superiority. These exercises reinforced the perception of foreign dominance while simultaneously intimidating any potential rebels. Foreign engineers and surveyors worked alongside military personnel, mapping the city for future infrastructure projects, extending telegraph lines, and planning railway connections that would facilitate both military movement and commerce. Despite the oppressive atmosphere, life adapted. Schools reopened under the supervision of foreign advisors, churches rebuilt by missionaries resumed operations, and commerce slowly returned in controlled markets. Citizens learned to navigate curfews and checkpoints, complying outwardly with orders while maintaining cultural and social practices privately. Rumors, clandestine meetings, and underground societies persisted, however, ensuring that while outward compliance was evident, resistance and nationalism remained alive in the hearts of the population. The occupation, therefore, was not simply a military endeavor. It was a complex imposition of foreign culture, governance, and surveillance over the soul of a once sovereign capital. The presence of 8 foreign armies in Beijing had immediate strategic and political implications. Militarily, the city became a hub for coordinating operations across northern China, allowing the Allies to maintain influence over coastal cities, transport routes, and key trade nodes. Politically, the occupation enforced the terms of the Boxer Protocol, ensuring that Qing compliance with reparations, executions, and suppression of the Boxers was implemented without delay. By positioning soldiers permanently, the foreign powers guaranteed a form of quasi-colonial oversight, securing their economic and diplomatic interests while demonstrating the futility of rebellion against modern military force. The long-term presence of foreign troops transformed Beijing's social and political landscape. Neighborhoods surrounding the Legation Quarter became zones of foreign influence, with architecture, commerce, and governance reflecting Western models. Local officials, merchants, and citizens had to adapt to new regulations, often at the expense of traditional practices. The military presence also created tension between China's desire for sovereignty and the reality of foreign control, highlighting the stark power imbalance between a modernized world and a historically insular empire. Culturally, the occupation left a lasting imprint. Exposure to foreign military organization, language, and technology accelerated interest in modernization and reform among China's elites. Witnessing the disciplined structure of the occupying forces inspired young Chinese reformers to advocate for new schools, modern armies, and industrial advancement. Yet it also fueled anger, resentment, and nationalist sentiment. Stories of looting, strict enforcement, and foreign arrogance circulated throughout the provinces, feeding a growing desire to reclaim dignity and sovereignty. The international military presence in Beijing, while initially a tool of suppression, paradoxically sowed the seeds of modernization and revolution, shaping the trajectory of 20th century China. Christian missionaries had been active in China for centuries, but by the late 19th century, their presence had intensified in both urban and rural areas. Catholic and Protestant missions established schools, hospitals, and churches, often backed by foreign governments, creating networks of influence that extended across provinces. Many missionaries provided much-needed social services, including medical care, education, and famine relief. In doing so, they gained a degree of respect, but their presence also fueled resentment among locals who viewed them as symbols of foreign interference. Missionaries often challenged traditional Chinese beliefs and cultural practices, promoting conversion to Christianity as both a spiritual and moral imperative. Their insistence on prohibiting ancestral worship, their criticism of Confucian rituals, and their promotion of Western education created cultural tension. Many peasants, deeply rooted in local religious practices and Confucian ethics, felt alienated by these newcomers. Missionaries became associated with Western imperial power, their churches and schools protected by foreign governments, making them targets of suspicion and hostility. By the 1890s, this tension escalated. As anti-foreign sentiment spread, missionaries were increasingly perceived not as benevolent educators or healers, but as agents of a larger scheme to undermine Chinese sovereignty and culture. The Boxers, who combined spiritual fervor with nationalist goals, targeted these missionaries as symbols of foreign oppression. Stories circulated among peasants of missionaries exploiting the poor, disrespecting local customs, and leveraging foreign power to protect themselves. In the minds of the Boxers and many ordinary citizens, Christianity had become inseparable from imperialist intrusion, and violence against missionaries was both symbolic and strategic. When the Boxer Rebellion erupted in 1899 to 1900, missionaries became immediate targets. Entire communities were attacked, churches burned, and clergy killed. Missionaries in rural regions were often isolated and defenseless, forced to hide or flee to fortified towns. In Beijing, where the infamous siege of the Legation Quarter occurred, missionaries alongside diplomats faced the direct wrath of Boxers who viewed them as the embodiment of foreign threat. Many lived in constant fear, witnessing the deaths of fellow missionaries and converts. Reports from the period described the horrors faced by Christian communities. Missionaries were sometimes captured, interrogated, and executed publicly. Converts, especially Chinese Christians, suffered greatly, being perceived as collaborators with foreigners. Families of converts were often expelled from villages or had their property seized. Missionaries who survived the violence relied on military protection from foreign forces, particularly during the siege of Beijing, where European and American soldiers defended the Legation Quarter. This reliance reinforced the association between missionaries and foreign military power, cementing the perception that Christianity and Western dominance were inextricably linked. Despite the danger, missionaries documented the rebellion extensively. Their letters, journals, and reports sent abroad detailed the atrocities committed by the Boxers, the destruction of property, and the social upheaval across northern China. While these accounts emphasized suffering, they also portrayed missionaries as agents of civilization and progress. Their writings influenced international opinion, providing justification for foreign military intervention and shaping the narrative that the rebellion was both a cultural and humanitarian crisis, rather than solely a political or social conflict. After the defeat of the Boxers and the signing of the Boxer Protocol, missionaries returned to northern China, though the environment remained tense. Churches and schools had been destroyed, converts traumatized, and communities deeply suspicious. Yet the international military presence offered protection, allowing missionary activities to resume, albeit under stricter security and often with the support of foreign troops. The Qing government, compelled by the terms of the Boxer Protocol, actively cooperated with missionaries, guaranteeing their safety and encouraging the rebuilding of institutions. The rebellion left a complex religious legacy. On one hand, it exposed the dangers of linking spiritual practice with foreign power. The Boxers' violent attacks on missionaries became a cautionary tale about the consequences of cultural and religious confrontation. On the other hand, Christianity's presence in China persisted, expanding through education, hospitals, and charitable works. Converts often became intermediaries between foreign powers and local communities, further complicating social dynamics. For Chinese society, the Boxer Rebellion reinforced the tension between tradition and foreign influence. While Confucian and local spiritual practices had fueled the Boxers' resistance, the catastrophic failure demonstrated that faith alone could not protect communities from modern military technology or political manipulation. The role of missionaries became emblematic of the broader cultural clash. Religion was not merely spiritual, but also political, social, and nationalistic. In the decades that followed, Chinese reformers and revolutionaries would grapple with this legacy, seeking ways to modernize and protect the nation without surrendering cultural identity. A struggle whose roots lay in the violent confrontation between Boxers and missionaries in 1900. The outbreak and eventual suppression of the Boxer Rebellion reverberated across the globe, capturing the attention of every major power with interests in China. European nations, the United States, and Japan closely monitored events, interpreting the rebellion as both a threat to their citizens and a test of imperial authority. Newspapers in London, Paris, Berlin, and Washington reported on the violence, often sensationalizing attacks on missionaries and foreign legations to justify military intervention. Diplomats argued that decisive action was necessary not only to protect lives, but also to maintain commercial and political influence in East Asia. The Allied intervention, a coalition of 8 nations, was swift and overwhelming. Each nation contributed troops, supplies, and artillery to protect their legations and enforce their demands. Diplomats engaged in complex negotiations, coordinating troop movements, defining spheres of control, and establishing joint military strategy to avoid conflicts among themselves. While ostensibly unified in purpose, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Competing economic interests, territorial ambitions, and historic rivalries influenced decisions, demonstrating that the Boxer Rebellion was as much a stage for international diplomacy as it was a domestic uprising in China. The public in foreign capitals reacted with a mix of outrage, fear, and moral indignation. Stories of massacres and the siege of legations stirred humanitarian concern, particularly in Britain and the United States. Yet, beyond the humanitarian lens, strategic interests were paramount. China's ports, trade routes, and vast markets were too valuable to risk destabilization. Governments sought to ensure that the rebellion's suppression would result in tangible advantages: indemnities, concessions, and guarantees of foreign privilege. Thus, the international response was both a moral crusade in appearance and a calculated exercise in geopolitical gain, setting the stage for far-reaching diplomatic consequences. The resolution of the rebellion came with the signing of the Boxer Protocol on September 7, 1901. This agreement, imposed under duress, codified the foreign powers' demands and formalized China's subjugation in the immediate aftermath of the conflict. The terms were severe, ensuring that the Qing dynasty bore full responsibility for both the rebellion and its suppression. China was required to pay 450 million taels of silver, a staggering sum, in installments over 39 years with interest, effectively diverting vast portions of national revenue to foreign powers. Beyond financial reparations, the Boxer Protocol mandated military and political concessions. Foreign troops were allowed to be stationed permanently in Beijing and along critical railway lines, ensuring rapid response in case of future uprisings. The Qing government was required to execute or punish officials who had supported the Boxers, and temples, shrines, and sites associated with Boxer activity were to be destroyed or closely monitored. Missionaries were guaranteed protection, their rights reinforced, and foreign powers gained unprecedented access to China's judicial and administrative processes. These provisions transformed China's internal affairs into matters of international oversight, effectively undermining sovereignty. The diplomatic consequences extended beyond immediate control. The Boxer Protocol established a precedent in which foreign powers could impose terms directly on an Asian nation under threat, blending military might with international law. It also demonstrated that no empire, no matter how ancient, could resist industrialized, coordinated foreign forces without modern infrastructure and reform. Politically, the protocol emboldened foreign powers to push further influence in other regions of China, reinforcing spheres of control and setting the stage for additional treaties and agreements. China's humiliation on the global stage would reverberate for decades, shaping both domestic reform movements and revolutionary thought. The Boxer Rebellion reshaped international relations in East Asia and beyond. European powers solidified their presence along China's coast, securing ports, concessions, and trade privileges that expanded economic control. Japan, having observed the Western powers' dominance and the Qing dynasty's weakness, accelerated its own modernization and imperial ambitions, preparing to become a dominant force in the region. The United States leveraged the rebellion to advocate for the open-door policy, emphasizing access to Chinese markets while claiming to respect territorial integrity, a policy that further complicated diplomatic negotiations. For the Qing dynasty, the rebellion marked a loss of international credibility and sovereignty. Diplomats recognized that foreign intervention could now dictate domestic policy. The dynasty's weakened position made it vulnerable to further demands, and its failure to resist foreign forces inspired reformers and revolutionaries to consider alternatives to imperial rule. This era of enforced foreign oversight, while humiliating, indirectly spurred China's modernization, as leaders realized that technological, military, and bureaucratic reform was essential to maintain national sovereignty. On a cultural level, the rebellion and its aftermath reinforced the perception of Western domination among the Chinese populace. Anti-foreign sentiment remained strong, fueled by tales of occupation, executions, and economic exploitation. Yet paradoxically, exposure to foreign military organization, education systems, and industrial techniques accelerated China's adaptation to modernity. Diplomatically, the Boxer Rebellion became a landmark event, illustrating the intersection of global power, local resistance, and national transformation. It demonstrated that domestic uprisings in China could no longer be viewed in isolation. They were inevitably tied to international interests, pressures, and consequences that would define the country's trajectory in the 20th century. The defeat of the Boxer Rebellion left the Qing dynasty deeply humiliated and politically paralyzed. Empress Dowager Cixi, who had initially supported the Boxers, faced immense pressure from foreign powers to comply with the Boxer Protocol's punitive terms. Her authority, once nearly absolute, was undermined by military failures, foreign occupation of the capital, and public resentment. The court struggled to maintain control, balancing appeasement of foreign powers with the need to prevent civil unrest at home. Internally, the Qing administration experienced significant upheaval. High-ranking officials who had advocated for or supported the Boxers were executed or removed from office. Provincial governors faced scrutiny for failing to suppress local uprisings, while loyal bureaucrats were burdened with implementing reparations, rebuilding destroyed infrastructure, and restoring civil order. The bureaucracy, already fragile, became overextended, tasked with managing foreign demands, domestic security, and the consequences of widespread social and economic disruption. The court recognized that survival depended on reform, but such changes were fraught with political risk. Traditionalists within the administration resisted modernization, fearing that adopting foreign methods would erode Confucian values and weaken imperial authority. Reform-minded officials argued that the dynasty's survival required immediate investment in military modernization, infrastructure, and education. The clash between conservatism and reform created an atmosphere of tension, paranoia, and cautious experimentation, as the Qing sought to navigate an unprecedented crisis in the twilight of imperial China. In the wake of Boxer defeat, the Qing court prioritized military reconstruction as a cornerstone of survival. The old banner forces, previously reliant on archaic weapons and spiritual morale, were supplemented by new, modernized regiments trained by foreign advisors. Emphasis was placed on disciplined drills, strategic maneuvers, and the use of contemporary firearms and artillery. Military academies were expanded, teaching both classical Confucian principles and Western tactics, reflecting the dual goals of modernization and cultural preservation. Administrative reforms were equally critical. The court sought to strengthen taxation systems to ensure revenue for both reparations and domestic governance. Provincial officials were reorganized, with clear chains of command and accountability mechanisms designed to prevent corruption and inefficiency. Telegraph lines and postal systems were modernized, allowing faster communication between Beijing and provincial centers, crucial for coordinating military and civil efforts. Education reform complemented these initiatives. Western science, engineering, and military theory were introduced alongside traditional Confucian curricula. The goal was to cultivate a new generation of officials capable of navigating a rapidly changing geopolitical landscape. These reforms, though uneven in execution and limited by bureaucratic resistance, reflected the court's recognition that the dynasty's survival depended on adapting to a world in which military might, industrial capacity, and knowledge outweighed spiritual or ceremonial authority. Despite these efforts, reform within the Qing court faced significant obstacles. Conservative factions viewed modernization as a threat to imperial legitimacy, opposing changes to the military, legal codes, and education systems. Regional warlords and provincial officials sometimes ignored central directives, undermining cohesion and complicating the implementation of reforms. Additionally, the Qing faced ongoing social unrest as peasants struggled under heavy taxation, reparations, and economic disruption caused by the Boxer Rebellion. The court also had to manage foreign scrutiny. Allied powers monitored the implementation of reforms, demanding compliance with military and civil stipulations in the Boxer Protocol. This external oversight constrained the dynasty's autonomy and heightened internal tension, as officials feared that any misstep could provoke intervention or further humiliation. Nevertheless, these challenges spurred incremental change. The Qing court's response to the Boxer Rebellion, though cautious and imperfect, marked a pivotal shift in imperial policy. Military modernization, bureaucratic restructuring, and educational reform represented the dynasty's acknowledgement that survival depended on adaptation. The reforms, implemented amidst foreign pressure and domestic instability, laid the groundwork for a new phase in China's history, one in which the traditional imperial order struggled to coexist with modernity, nationalism, and the demands of a rapidly globalizing world. The Qing dynasty, weakened but still intact, began a precarious journey toward modernization, learning from the catastrophic lessons of 1900. The Boxer Rebellion, despite its failure, acted as a catalyst for the rise of Chinese nationalism. The humiliation of 1900, the foreign occupation of Beijing, the enforced reparations, and the military defeat left an indelible mark on the national psyche. For the first time, large segments of Chinese society, from intellectuals to peasants, witnessed the overwhelming power of industrialized foreign nations and recognized the vulnerability of their own country. The Qing dynasty, unable to defend its people or territory effectively, became a symbol of weakness, prompting a growing belief that national survival required systemic change rather than blind loyalty to the imperial family. In the aftermath, reformers and revolutionaries began framing China's struggles in the context of national unity. Local intellectuals circulated essays, pamphlets, and journals highlighting the need for modernization, military preparedness, and centralized governance. They emphasized that the failures of the Boxer Rebellion were not solely due to foreign intervention, but also rooted in domestic corruption, outdated traditions, and inadequate governance. This awakening, initially confined to urban elites and reform-minded officials, slowly spread through the provinces, reaching merchants, students, and even educated peasants. The seeds of nationalism were sown, grounded in the understanding that China could no longer rely solely on ritual, superstition, or loyalty to a faltering dynasty. The Boxer Rebellion also generated a narrative of martyrdom and heroism. Boxers who had died fighting foreign powers, often vilified by the Qing court and later by foreign observers, were retrospectively celebrated in nationalist circles as symbols of courage, resistance, and sacrifice. Their defiance, though militarily futile, was woven into a broader cultural memory that emphasized Chinese resilience, collective identity, and the moral imperative of defending the nation. This narrative provided a moral and emotional foundation for future revolutionary movements and shaped the ideological framework of Chinese nationalism well into the 20th century. Following the Boxer Rebellion, Chinese intellectuals began formulating strategies for national revival that combined modernization with a renewed sense of cultural identity. Reformers argued for the adoption of Western science, military techniques, and industrial practices while preserving Chinese traditions deemed essential to national character. Schools teaching Western knowledge, engineering, and military strategy were expanded, and overseas study programs were established, sending young Chinese to Japan, Europe, and the United States to acquire skills that could strengthen the nation. Revolutionary societies, many of which had existed clandestinely prior to the Boxer Rebellion, gained new legitimacy and urgency. Groups such as the Tongmenghui, led by Sun Yat-sen, saw the rebellion's failure as evidence that the Qing dynasty could no longer safeguard the nation. These groups combined nationalist ideology with practical strategies for overthrowing imperial authority, drawing on lessons from the Boxers' popular mobilization and the social unrest that had accompanied the rebellion. Revolutionary rhetoric increasingly linked national sovereignty with social reform, education, and modernization, emphasizing that a strong, unified nation could prevent foreign domination and restore China's dignity. The influence of the Boxer Rebellion on revolutionary thought extended beyond elites. Peasant uprisings, regional militias, and local self-defense groups drew inspiration from the Boxers' grassroots organization, recognizing the potential for collective action even in the face of overwhelming odds. While military strategies differed and the Boxers' reliance on superstition was rejected, the principle of mobilizing ordinary citizens for national defense became a recurring theme in early 20th century revolutionary movements, demonstrating how the rebellion's legacy influenced both ideology and tactics. The cultural and political aftermath of the Boxer Rebellion reinforced nationalism as a powerful, unifying force in China. Anti-foreign sentiment, previously sporadic and localized, became a central pillar of national identity. Literature, theater, and folk storytelling preserved vivid accounts of the rebellion, blending historical fact with moral lessons and heroic symbolism. These narratives reinforced the idea that China's survival depended on collective effort, education, and modernization, while also warning of the dangers of disunity, corruption, and dependence on outdated practices. Education became a key tool for spreading nationalist ideals. Textbooks and curricula emphasized patriotic duty, historical awareness, and the importance of resisting foreign domination. Students were encouraged to understand both China's cultural heritage and the modern world, integrating lessons from Western military, industrial, and scientific advancements. Nationalist newspapers and journals disseminated these ideas widely, creating a shared sense of identity and purpose among urban and rural populations alike. By the early 20th century, the Boxer Rebellion's influence on Chinese nationalism was unmistakable. While the uprising itself had failed, the humiliation and aftermath generated a powerful ideological response that permeated politics, education, and culture. Nationalism became both a practical and symbolic framework, a call to reform, a strategy for survival, and a moral imperative for the protection of the Chinese nation. The rebellion's legacy thus extended far beyond its violent confrontations, shaping the motivations, strategies, and aspirations of the next generation of Chinese leaders and revolutionaries. The Boxer Rebellion marked one of the most dramatic clashes between tradition and modernity, nationalism and imperialism, in late 19th century China. Globally, the rebellion became emblematic of the fragility of traditional empires confronted with industrialized powers. Newspapers and scholars across Europe, America, and Japan analyzed the events, debating whether China's defeat represented moral failure, technological backwardness, or the inevitable consequences of global power imbalances. Western narratives often framed the uprising as a chaotic, irrational, and violent rejection of progress, portraying the Boxers as superstitious fanatics while highlighting the efficiency of foreign militaries and governance. This global perception, however, overlooked the deeper social, economic, and political grievances that fueled the movement. Anti-foreign sentiment in China was not merely irrational. It was a reaction to decades of exploitation, unequal treaties, missionary encroachment, and territorial concessions. The rebellion revealed the vulnerability of the Qing dynasty, the fragility of local governance, and the consequences of neglecting popular sentiment. Historians today recognize the Boxer Rebellion as a complex, multi-layered event, illustrating both the dangers of foreign domination and the resilience of a society attempting to defend cultural integrity and sovereignty under immense pressure. The rebellion also forced China into unprecedented interactions with global powers. The international military intervention, the imposition of the Boxer Protocol, and subsequent financial and political oversight made China's internal affairs inseparable from global diplomacy. This interconnectedness shaped not only the immediate post-rebellion period, but also China's trajectory into the 20th century, influencing reform movements, revolutionary strategies, and the eventual drive toward modernization and nationalism. In this sense, the Boxer Rebellion was both a local tragedy and a pivotal moment in global history, highlighting the clash of empires, cultures, and ideas at the dawn of modernity. The Qing dynasty's response to the Boxer Rebellion provides a cautionary tale about the necessity of adaptation, reform, and awareness of global realities. The failure to modernize the military, integrate technological advancements, or engage effectively with international diplomacy directly contributed to the dynasty's humiliation and the foreign occupation of Beijing. Additionally, the reliance on spiritual invulnerability and traditional martial practices, as demonstrated by the Boxers, proved tragically insufficient in the face of modern firearms and coordinated military strategy. From a governance perspective, the rebellion highlighted the consequences of corruption, inefficiency, and disconnect from the populace. Provincial and local officials often failed to manage social unrest or coordinate defense, while the central administration underestimated both the internal and external threats to stability. This failure underscored the need for institutional reform, bureaucratic accountability, and centralized planning, lessons that would influence subsequent attempts at modernization and ultimately fuel revolutionary sentiment. Socially, the Boxer Rebellion emphasized the importance of public trust and national unity. The widespread suffering caused by reparations, foreign occupation, and suppression of the uprising revealed the devastating impact of alienation between rulers and subjects. Scholars and reformers recognized that a strong nation required both capable governance and social cohesion. These lessons, painful as they were, laid the groundwork for the intellectual and political movements that would shape China's early 20th century transformation, from modernization initiatives to revolutionary upheaval. The cultural and political legacy of the Boxer Rebellion extended far beyond the immediate devastation. Nationalist sentiment, already simmering in response to foreign encroachment, was intensified by the events of 1900. The memory of occupation, indemnities, and martyrdom became central to narratives of Chinese resistance and identity. Intellectuals and reformers used the rebellion as a moral and historical reference point, emphasizing the necessity of education, military modernization, and industrial advancement. Folk culture preserved tales of courage, resistance, and loss, ensuring that the rebellion's lessons permeated both elite and popular consciousness. Politically, the rebellion accelerated the decline of the Qing dynasty. The court's weakened legitimacy, combined with foreign oversight and domestic unrest, set the stage for the revolutionary movements that culminated in the 1911 Xinhai Revolution. Even the reforms implemented after the rebellion, though limited, reflected a recognition that China could no longer rely solely on tradition or ceremonial authority. Instead, the country needed a synthesis of modernization, national unity, and strategic engagement with the global order. Finally, the Boxer Rebellion serves as a historical lens through which modern scholars understand the complexities of cultural resistance, imperialism, and nationalism. It illustrates the dangers of underestimating foreign technological and military power, the consequences of social alienation, and the enduring power of collective identity and resistance. While the Boxers themselves were defeated, the ideological and cultural reverberations of their movement helped shape China's path toward reform, revolution, and the emergence of a new national consciousness. The rebellion's legacy is thus both tragic and transformative, a profound reminder that history is often forged at the intersection of power, belief, and the relentless march of change. So today, we've witnessed the full story of the Boxer Rebellion, a movement born from faith, nationalism, and desperation, facing the harsh realities of modern imperialism. We saw how tradition clashed with technology, courage met overwhelming force, and ordinary people shaped history through their resistance. The moral of the story? Courage alone cannot overcome oppression without strategy, organization, and adaptation. Yet even in defeat, the Boxer Rebellion inspired change, sowed the seeds of nationalism, and left lessons that would echo through China's journey into the 20th century. If you found this journey into history as fascinating as we did, make sure to subscribe to History Teller YT, because here, every story is more than dates and facts. It's an experience. Hit that bell to stay updated, and join us again for another deep dive into the moments that shaped our world.